Welcome to the PMI Victorian History Library. Thanks for coming out for one of our afternoon talks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging your Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and paying my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations traditions of knowledge keeping and knowledge management. So if you haven't been to the PMI before, you're going to learn a lot about the organisation and our marvellous 170-year history. But I'll just give you the quick sort of runaround. If anyone needs the bathrooms, you go out that door at the back, go right, and it's the first door on the left, or out this door here, down the corridor, and then it's on the right. In the very unlikely event of a fire, go in the direction the fire isn't. But you can go down the fire exit down that corridor or a fire exit out the front as well, and just follow myself or any of our other staff members who are around, and they'll take you on that way. So we've been around since 1854. We hold a collection of more than 40,000 items, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey of the history of this fascinating institute. We are being filmed, and this is going up on YouTube, and there will be some photos taken as well. So if anyone has any issues with that or wants to particularly not be included, come and see myself or Lauren, who's down the back, and we can make that happen. So the obvious place to begin when you're looking at the history of the PMI is, what does PMI actually stand for? So it stands for Brand Mechanics Institute. But what is a Mechanics Institute? Firstly, it has absolutely nothing to do with cars. A couple of years ago, I actually had a phone call from someone who'd broken down on Chapel Street, whose car wasn't working at all. Unfortunately, I had to tell them that we might be able to provide a book on the history of the car, that we couldn't help them fix it, though I did actually direct them to a good mechanic. But that's what a Mechanics Institute isn't. So what is it? Essentially, mechanic is a 19th century term for blue-collar worker. The first instance of the concept behind Mechanics Institutes was in 1800 when Dr. George Birkbeck gave a lecture circa 1800, it's debatable whether it's 1799 or 1800, gave a lecture to skilled labourers about how their tools were made. The lectures proved to be incredibly popular because he deliberately did them outside normal work hours so that the workers could actually attend. This was a period of time when education was not easily accessible unless you had money. The lectures were popular enough that they became the foundation for Mechanics Institutes. First one opened in Edinburgh in 1821, quickly followed with the Edinburgh School of Arts, quickly followed by the London Mechanics Institute in 1823. They were founded to provide educational opportunities for adults through talks, facilities such as chess and pianos, and most importantly, as far as the PMI is concerned, lending libraries. These institutions were all founded individually. There was never an overarching body that managed them. And when Victoria was colonised, they spread like wildfire. By 1900, there were more than 1,000 in Victoria alone. And most country towns, you'll still see a Mechanics Institute hall. For the most part, Mechanics Institute halls these days are just halls. There's a few hundred that are still run by a committee, and each of these is a really important part of their community. But there are only 9 that have a lending library and 5 that have a professionally staffed lending library, and we're one of those. So if you're wondering what the oldest is, we're the second oldest library in Victoria and the second oldest Mechanics Institute. This is the oldest. This is the Melbourne Athenaeum. So they own the entire building that the Athenaeum Theatre is in, and they actually rent the theatre out. So their library is upstairs. They've got a fantastic collection if you're ever interested. They were founded in 1839. The other ones that still have lending libraries are Footscray Mechanics Institute, Berwick Mechanics Institute, and Ballarat Mechanics Institute. That makes up the 5 of the professionally staffed lending libraries. Bonnie Doon, Little River, Malvern, and I believe it's Tarrangara is just building a library, but they all have lending libraries that are volunteer run. So that's the background covered. This brings us to the foundation of the PMI itself. The PMI was founded in 1854 for the mental, moral improvement and rational recreation of its members, and this was done through a lending library and philosophical apparatus, etc. I've never actually managed to find a decent definition of what they meant by philosophical apparatus, etc. So, at the time, Prahran was not an inner suburb of Melbourne. It was a remote village surrounded by a swamp. This is Chapel Street in 1864, so you can only imagine how remote it was 10 years beforehand. There wasn't a council. In fact, there wasn't much of anything. Though I do want to make very clear this was not unoccupied land. There were First Nations people here for tens of thousands of years before any of us started showing up. But the first town council actually met in Mechanics Institute. We predate the town council. So the local community decided they wanted a Mechanics Institute. And this is where our journey begins. The driver of the idea and of the residents was Reverend William Moss, who was this gentleman with the lovely beard just here. Moss was a local congregational minister. He also played a key role in the formation of the Royal Institute for the Blind and the Victorian College for the Deaf and Prahran Mission. All three bodies are still operational today. He's also described as having sparkling blue eyes. So I've always been a bit sad we don't have a colour photo. So the other three trustees of the Institute were Frederick James Sargood, who was a local parliamentarian. He was the father of the Sargood who built Ripon Lee, who was very confusingly called Frederick Thomas Sargood. George William Rusden, who is this gentleman here, who was Victorian Clerk of Parliament, and local surgeon Dr. James Stokes, who we sadly don't have a picture of. A meeting was held on the 1st of May, 1854, and the PMI declared itself into existence, which you could do at that point. The Argus recorded some of the speeches, and I thought I'd read you the opening of a speech by Mr. Allabart, so you have an idea of how lofty their ambitions were. The institution has, for its primary objects, first, the rational recreation, and secondly, the intellectual improvement of artisans. Continual peace and onward progress of civilization have made the artisans to be a class increasing in numbers and rising in importance throughout the world, especially in our native land. And the very peculiar circumstances of this colony have made that he feels an independence and an elevation in his social condition, which he's never enjoyed in any former period of history. In this possession, he feels his dignity as a man. He demands some higher enjoyment than those pleasures which are common to the brute animal. He desires to elevate and polish his mind. He is willing to open his purse to obtain the means of gratifying his instinct for the acquisition of knowledge, which is common to the whole human race. A year ago, it was generally said in England that the best workmen had emigrated to these lands. We see the correctness of that opinion in some degree corroborated tonight. For no mean spirit could have originated a mechanics institution in a village in such a condition as ours. The mechanics of Prahran, though labouring under the disadvantages of recent colonisation, have commenced by a strong impulse the Mechanics Institute. They have done more. They have become missionaries of civilisation. So they weren't really thinking small. They were building what they saw as a grand vision. And I also think it's worth pointing out at this point that as much of this as Mechanics Institutes are a grand vision, they also could be quite paternalistic. There was definitely an element, there's a lot of connections with the temperance societies, and there's definitely an element of if you give the working class some education, it'll keep them out of the clubs. So that also has to be considered when you're looking at the foundation. All right, so we had an organisation, and now they needed a patron. The PMI was very much part of the colonial establishment. So they reached out to the Governor of Victoria, Charles Hotham, and his wife Jane to be the patrons. We not only hold the original acceptance letter from Governor Hotham agreeing to be our patron, that's in our archives, we also have this lovely little letter where Governor Hotham agreed to accept the congratulations for his acceptance in person. So he wrote a letter saying, yes, you can come and thank me for agreeing to be your patron. You can see both of them on the screen. And yes, it's a bit of a translation of this cursive, which actually it's on the second page. So it will afford him great pleasure to receive the congratulations of the Crown Mechanics Institute on Monday next. So they were rooting the PMI to the highest echelons of colonial establishment. The committee and the trustees did not sit idle. By the end of 1854, they had members and books and fittings and a secretary, as you can see from this 1854 financial report on the screen. They even had stationery. What they didn't have is a building. You'll see listed deposit for ground, which is over here. Oh, here it is. Deposit for ground and design for the buildings. Oh, it's still on the far right there. In the meantime, they're making a church and then the small hut they built on land they managed to purchase. They had much grander plans though. However, the physical foundation of the Mechanics Institute at this time wasn't a simple process. With negotiation with the Colonial Secretary to try to find land, there's a lot of back and forth in our letters about trying to get the Colonial Secretary to just give them land. In the end, James Mason, a local publican, that's him there, and local Labor councillor donated the land next to his pub, the PMI building in Chapel Street, and the committee bought some of the adjoining land. It was said at the time that Mason did it because he figured that when people started coming out of the Mechanics Institute, they go to the nearest pub. He denied that. But it's also possible he actually sold the land to the PMI rather than donating it. But when he was asked, he insisted it was just to legalise the conveyancing. So regardless of his motives, Mason was committed to his charitable work, and he was one of PMI's first life members, which he bought for 10 guineas in 1856. So on the screen, you can see a couple of building receipts. So these again are from our archives. They're both C.B. Butcher's, who was a local builder, and it's a little bit hard to read, but it's all for building materials for the new building. So leaving aside the problems of getting the land, a building was erected on the site by 1856 at 259 to 261 Chapel Street, a site that the PMI still owns. So the building was opened in 1857 by Sir Henry Berkeley with a grand concept. This was done on 26th of January 1857. We are lucky enough to hold one of the original invitations, which is what you can see up here. It's printed on silk, and we actually only received it in late 2014 when we had no idea this invitation existed, and then an New Zealand engineering company rang us and said, "We found this in a drawer, would you like it?" We said yes. We had no idea how it ended up in New Zealand. It was in pieces as well, so we raised some money to have it restored, and you can see the joining lines. It was in 3 different pieces. So we had it properly restored and a box built for it, so it lives its own little box. This grand opening was very much a grand opening. So it was reported on in the Argus. So the mechanical building was described as a plain and substantial blue stone building, and that the lecture hall was built to accommodate upwards of 200 persons, and it was densely crowded. So it was a real event in Paran when this building opened. And this is the building that they're talking about. We're not entirely sure what the date of this photo is. It's actually held by the National Library, but we know it's late 1800s. So this is the substantial bluestone building, which unfortunately isn't there anymore, but we'll get back to that in a second. And this is what it looks like from a bit further up the street. So that's the Mechanics Institute there, and that's the Town Hall, which is still standing. So if you're familiar at all with Chapel Street, that gives you an idea of how it would have worked. So this would have been gravel just in here. It's a little gap. So once the building was opened, it was important for more than just the foundation of the PMI. Because as I said, from 1856 until 1861, when this lovely building was built, the Town Hall, the Crown Council actually met in our building. A free municipal library was opened in the Town Hall in 1861. The Institute provided lectures, a lending library, a piano for musical evenings, chess clubs and other events. The very early years of the PMI were largely trouble-free, apart from when the title deeds were misplaced for a number of months. The PMI holds a series of letters that show community members writing backwards and forth, trying to work out what on earth happened to them, including sending letters to the UK, to one of the trustees that had moved back there to see if he'd accidentally taken them with him. They were eventually found to be in the possession of a Mr. Page, and nobody seems to be entirely sure how they got there. There are also several letters about a piano, particularly a lot of concern over damage to the piano's legs. So you can see how much it was being used as a community space. The first real crisis came in 1868, when PMI Secretary William John Allen wrote an anonymous letter to the South Melbourne Standard in which he wasn't very pleasant about one of the PMI committee members, Reverend William Potter. He alluded to Reverend Potter's possible election to the committee of the Emerald Hill Institute, saying, "I do not think that any committee can be expected to appoint a candidate because he happens to possess an agency for the Melbourne newspapers, as well as several others, or elect a minister obnoxious to the vast majority of residents. So he wasn't pulling his punches, he was pretty much accusing Potter of nepotism and corruption. So now, unfortunately for Ellen, the letter didn't stay anonymous. Reverend Potter was friends with the editor of the Standard, so Ellen might have had a point. And he happily revealed the true author of the letter. We have the text from the letter because Potter had it included in the minutes from the PMI committee meeting, the 6th of April 1868. This was the same meeting where Ellen was summarily dismissed, but he refused to go as his dismissal. He believed his dismissal to be unjust. He might have had a point. What he did, though, brought the PMI to a standstill. At the time, the Secretary was a live-in position, and Ellen refused to leave. He was effectively squatting in the building. So ultimately, the committee moved in under the cover of darkness to remove part of the roof, thus making the building unlivable and forcing Ellen out. So the PMI did end up in court of the incident, which was, again, recorded fascinatingly in the Argus. So this is actually William John Ellen writing to the Argus, complaining about the letter that the committee had written about him. The report is full of gross contradictions and misstatements, being more the appearance of a document concocted to serve part purpose than a genuine account of the progress of a public institute. So this whole thing was played out, particularly in the Argus, and you can follow it in Trove. And then this is a notification from 1868, which again, discussing the incident. So Ellen even sued the roofer who removed the tiles, but he was ultimately only awarded damages for his lost salary of £14. So the PMI recovered from this crisis with lectures and classes, but by the 1890s it had fallen into disrepair again. The Secretary Librarian at the time was George Cross, and by the 1890s he'd become quite elderly and couldn't maintain the library as well as being uncontactable. There were several letters in the archives discussing everyone from the town clerk down trying to contact Cross about membership. This made joining the library pretty much impossible because he wasn't replying to any letters. By 1899, the PMI had 10 members and a completely useless collection. The council got involved as well as the local community and went to Parliament to rescue the institute, which led to the PMI Mechanics Institute Act number 1617, which I'll come back to in just a second. So once Cross was removed, with difficulty but without taking the roof off, Aeneas Gunn, the Melbourne Public Library, now the State Library Librarian, whom the name's familiar, he was the husband of the very well-known Mrs. Aeneas Gunn, who wrote We of the Never Never. He was brought in to do an assessment of the collection. In a letter on our archives, he described the collection as, without exception, to be in a shockingly neglected and filthy condition. The best pieces were consigned to auction to raise money for the organisation, and the rest was destroyed. Just something that I look back on what we could have had in the collection if this hadn't happened. In particular, Ferdinand von Mueller, who was one of the very early directors of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, he's put together sample books of Australian plants and sent them to most of the mechanics institutes. And I saw a state library blog about this because they picked their copy up much later. And they actually have like the original plants in them and descriptions. So I got back into our minute books and checked. And yeah, we had a full set of them. And we've got the record of when they arrived, and I have no record of what happened to them. So if they survived this process, they would have been sold to raise money for the library, which makes sense, but I would really, really like to have them in the collection. So pretty much the building had to be rebuilt on the site in the early 1900s, and most of the collection was burnt or sold. The PMI still owns this building and rents them out of shops to raise money for the library. But to return to the Act of Parliament, the Act was an intervention to rescue the PMI. Frederick T. Sargood, so the son of our original trustee Frederick J. Sargood, came together with Prahran Council and concerned residents of Prahran to secure intervention from the government in the form of an Act. The Act dissolved the organisation, the new committee took possession of the property and immediately dismissed Cross and advertised the position. So this is the original printout of the Act. And what you can see here is this is a letter from our archives where one of the members of the Legislative Assembly wrote to us to let us know that the Act was about to pass. And this is Frederick Thomas Sargood's comment on the Act, again from a letter in our archives. So it tells you the bill introduced last session was intended, I believe, to obtain for the ratepayers of Crown the use of the Mechanics Institute. I need hardly say that such a measure will have my hearty support. So this was again the community coming together to save this institute that they considered theirs. All right. So the committee and the trustees, this was a new beginning for the PMI, and the Act helped to keep it alive over the coming century, though it eventually outlived its usefulness. It's in fact in the process of being repealed, but I'll return to that a little bit later. Part of the revitalisation of the PMI was down to the new secretary, who was appointed in 1900, John Henry Furneaux. I really like that picture of him too. His role was to rebuild the library physically and through the membership base. As part of this, it was recognised that someone actually who worked specifically as a librarian was needed, and Florence Bartleman, that one there, was appointed in 1907. So Florence was actually our first female librarian and our first person who was appointed specifically to be a librarian. So she's a fantastic symbol of the professionalisation of the library profession, and also the legacy that she left of all the library professionals who have managed this collection and this library going forward. We're also very lucky to have this photo, because the only reference we have to her is literally one line in our minute books saying that a Miss Bartleman was appointed. She was from Middle Brighton. So when I worked with Jade, our marketing communications officer, to put together the exhibition, you can see it's down the corridor as well for 170th. I wanted to track her down. So after using Trove and Ancestry and some of our own resources, I eventually, I found her full name, and then through a bit of light Facebook stalking, I found her granddaughter. So her granddaughter was nice enough to send us this picture, as well as another family picture, a really big family picture, and this one features in our exhibition along the corridor. So it's a really lovely circle of coming together of me using the professional skills that I've effectively inherited from Florence to find Florence, which I think is just, it's a really lovely little circle. So one of the key challenges Furneaux faced early on in his tenure was the move to amalgamate the PMI with the Council's Paran Library. So the PMI membership rose in fervent opposition, which a number of letters in our archives can attest to. And we have this extraordinary survival, which is a petition against the amalgamation. You can just see, no, 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 no. This is one page of several. This lives quite safely in our archives, and yet get everyone's name and addresses and signatures, which is amazing too. So once this challenge was seen off, Furneaux turned his attention to the classes and the educative aspect of the PMI. Classes were resumed in 1908, and it was soon decided that a larger building was needed. So the PMI established the Paran Technical School. The Chapel Street building was mortgaged to buy land on High Street. It took them 32 years to pay the mortgage off, and a new building was built. The PMI occupied 140 High Street from 1915 until the beginning of 2015, when we moved into this building. So the foundation stone of 140 High Street was laid by Sir Andrew Peacock in 1915, when the PMI moved to the new premises. To commemorate this occasion, a silver trowel was presented to Sir Andrew, which is this one here. I'll return to that one in a second. With the new building open, the Chapel Street buildings were leased out, raising much needed money for the PMI, as they still are today. Even before the new building was opened, though, it was clear that the PMI didn't have the funds or the experience to run the technical school as well as the library. So the PMI provided leased the parts of the building set aside for the technical school to the Minister for Education for only 20 shillings a year, with the understanding that the Education Department would run the school and leave the PMI enough space on the ground floor to run the library. The lease expired in 1947, and a new lease for 99 years was drawn up with a peppercorn rent, 1 shilling a year, again with the proviso that the Department of Education would run the technical school. This lease would go on to cause the PMI immense problems by the late 90s and early 2000s, but I'll return to that in a second. In the meantime, I want to look at the silver trowel. In 1995, there was a discussion with Deakin University, who at that point were occupying the High Street campus of what had been Paran Tech School, over what should happen to the trowel, which Deakin currently had. In the end, the PMI had a replica made and presented it to Deakin in return for the original. as Deakin were moving out of the building. The original was put in the safe in Prahran Town Hall until a safe display case could be decided on. This is where the story gets interesting. The PMI didn't attempt to retrieve the trail until the 150th anniversary in 2004. Unfortunately, over this nearly 10-year period, there have been a lot of council amalgamations and the trail had vanished off the face of the earth. So sadly, the celebration had to go ahead with just a photo of the trail. But it doesn't stop there. In 2005, Di Foster, who was the local history officer for Malvern, found a key to a safe that she hadn't been able to open. The safe had come from the Malvern Town Hall's clerk's office. When Di opened the safe, miraculously, the trail was inside. And you can see it all in all its glory in the picture, and it's in our archives as well, if anyone ever wants to have a look at it. Too much other pages. But to return to the early 1900s and the development of the PMI in High Street. So under Furneaux, the PMI revived and in some ways went from strength to strength, with classes and lectures, but sadly the collection didn't. Furneaux retired in 1938 and a report commissioned into the whole building in 1939 said, "Your book purchases have been made off travellers' calling. This is not a good system of purchase, and a very large portion of your stock must be destroyed owing to its dirty and dilapidated condition." 7,000 books were removed from the shelves and the whole interior of the library at 140 High Street was remodelled, including the addition of a reading room and a smoker's lounge. But most interestingly, for me anyway, it was also recommended that the books be classified under Dewey's system, which is implying that they weren't already. So we predate Dewey. So we seem to be working off our own subject system prior to that, but from this date, we do know that we started using it. Essentially, over the next decades, the PMI continued to continue. Nothing truly remarkable happened, though some of the letters show a fantastic small scale of history that running a lending library involved. The library was refurbished a handful of times, as were the Chapel Street buildings, in order to continue to have tenants. Long-term tenants included Portmans and Witness, and you can see an amazing drawing of a proposed redevelopment of the Witness store from the 1970s. And it's the most 1970s drawing I've ever seen, I think. And this is full, it folds out to about this size as well. So the PMI enjoyed a bit of a resurgence in World War II, gaining many new members, raising money regularly for the war effort. As for the technical school, the junior part operated until 1971 on the site. So that's this building here. And the senior design section of the school operated until the 1990s. In 1992, Prahran Tech disintegrated. The art side merged with BCA, while the business school and general studies merged with Deakin. What remained was Prahran TAFE, and it was merged with Swinburne TAFE, marking the end of an era. Prahran Tech's archives are held by Deakin Uni. The site was taken over by Deakin University and then ultimately by Swinburne. The PMI itself was in decline by the 1980s. The library was competing with other forms of entertainment and other lending libraries. Under Laurie McCorman, who joined the PMI committee in 1980, assessments of future directions were taken, and the decision was reached to specialise in Victorian history, including local histories of places in Victoria. This new direction began with a small local history, collection of local histories, and grew to the 40,000 strong library you see today. You can see this is one of our first forays. So it's Prahran Mechanics Institute and Circulating Library, Local History and Victorian Library. So this is when we started really specialising, really saying this was our purpose. In 1984, Bruce Tanner, who is this gentleman in the middle, became Secretary Librarian, and it was under Bruce's leadership that the Victorian History Library really began to take shape. He sourced books from all over the country, even going so far as to write to the Danish consulate about a book about bikes. The PMI archives are a treasure trove of Bruce's letters, as he chose to chase down obscure titles and promoted the PMI. There's a fantastic letter from him to the ABC telling them that they should do more TV series about Columbus. Still not entirely sure why he wanted that, but never mind. Bruce was Secretary Librarian until 1966, and the new millennium was ushered in by Secretary Librarians Catherine Millward-Basin and then Tim McKenna. The biggest excitement from the 1990s was removing the door to a room that had been locked for 30 years. In March 1996, at the PMI's previous home at 140 High Street, PMI Secretary Librarian Catherine Millward-Basin had the door removed to a storeroom that had been locked for 30 years. The key had been lost. Inside was a treasure trove of documents, most relating to the history of Brand Tech. The items in the room were appraised by Anthony Patrice, the archivist for Deakin University, which took over part of Brand Tech, and are now form a important part of Deakin's archives, and can be viewed there. At the time, Anthony said in a Herald Sun article about the locked room that one of the most interesting things he found was a report from a medical society who found the students at the school undernourished and undersized as they had to work as well as study. By the early 2010s, the library was desperately in need of more space in the High Street building. Swinburne was now occupying the old Brand Tech site under the original 1947 Peppercorn lease from the Minister for Education. As the PMI needed the space and Swinburne were not occupying it under the original terms of the lease, the PMI launched a campaign to get the building back. After much wrangling, the details of which I won't go into, the Minister of Education agreed to vacate the lease under the proviso that the PMI sold the buildings at High Street to Swinburne. The membership of the PMI was consulted and was ultimately agreed to sell the buildings. So under Tim McKenna, the PMI took its biggest change in nearly 100 years. They bought the building you're sitting in now. You can see community member Chris Michaelopoulos signing the cheque when we purchased this building. And we moved just down the road. So you can see what it looked like originally on the slide. So this is the building that you're sitting in now before we remodelled it. We think it was an early 1800s, a mid-1800s building originally because this brick wall follows this laneway, nothing is straight. It was definitely a 1960s fabric factory, which was then converted into offices, and the PMI converted it into a library. While in many ways we would have preferred to stay in the original building, the new PMI building has provided so much more space and accessibility to the collection. Moved in the beginning of 2015 and hoping to stay for many years to come. The PMI still owns the original buildings in Chapel Street and is very much still connected to its roots. The general collection was slowly weeded out until it was removed entirely around 2013-2014, and this decision has led to the building you see today and this collection, a 40,000 strong collection of Victorian and Australian history. It's the only full-blown collection of its type in the world. But we're not quite done with the history of the PMI. Like the rest of the world, in 2020, the PMI found itself living history with a capital H. We adapted, survived, working from home, as you can see in the photos. And I vividly remember filling my car up with books to take home for cataloguing. We worked with our volunteers to make sure they felt supported too. And you can see one of our regular Zoom sessions up there. And we did our utmost to make sure that everyone stayed connected as part of the PMI community, including offering click and collect services when allowed. My favourite reference query during this entire time period was when one of our heritage architects had to know what the building was made of and the scans weren't being high-res enough for him. So he sent one of his colleagues who lived within the 5 kilometres to come over when I was running click and collect, and I took the book down and stood on the front step and held it out like that. So he could look at the picture at the bottom while staying 1.5 metres away and not touching the book so I didn't have to sanitise it. And he determined it was made of brick and then went home very happy. It's still one of my favourite reference queries because it shows how much this can really still help people. The PMI also recognised that this was an opportunity to collect history. It became very rapidly clear that we were living in the period of history with a capital H. I wanted to ensure that it was documented as it happened, not retrospectively. Why this is so important was made clear from our existing collection. We existed as a library during the 1919 pandemic, and while we have lots of books written afterwards, there's only one letter in the archives about the pandemic itself. So I wasn't going to miss the opportunity this time. So we kept everything, every sign we put up, every QR code, every density limit, and when I was vaccinated at the showgrounds, I kept the sticker saying, "You've been vaccinated." And that's now in the ephemera collection. We also have Christmas cards with Santa wearing a mask, and of course books, which you can see on the screen. These range from professionally published accounts of nurses during the pandemic, to art books made in lockdown, which is one of these, to books by kindergarten children about being in a bubble. This is the Burundara Kindergarten Bubble book. And to a self-published book about all the birds that one person saw during lockdown. My favourite title was actually a zine I picked up last year, which isn't in this picture, but it's just called Fuzzy Rose in Despair, which I think sums up the whole situation quite perfectly. So collecting history and building a history collection isn't just about collecting it, it's about telling a story, and if we can do contemporary collecting to do that, then it can tell us about our own history as well. And the PMI, with the rest of us, made it through. So our final piece of history brings us right up to date. It's the repeal of the PMI Act from 1899, which we looked at earlier in this talk. The Act has been an important part of the PMI's history, and the fact that it's one of the oldest statutes on the books at Parliament attests to this. It's also protected the PMI from folding during lean times, especially in the mid-1900s, when membership was in double digits. It's reached the end of its useful life, though, and with the PMI incorporated under the Associations and Corporation Act Reform Act 2012. In 2023, the decision was made by the PMI board to request Parliament to repeal the Act. This is a process that began in 2024 with second reading speeches in August this year. The Act will most likely be repealed by the end of the year. The second reading speeches proved to be actually a really interesting read, with many members of Parliament discussing both Mechanics Institutes and the PMI at length. You can see a couple of the comments on the screen. So this is actually from our local member, and I've got permission from Hansard to put it on our social media and the website as well as an actual quote, as long as we reference it properly. So to conclude, the PMI Victorian History Library is an incredible asset for our local community and also our state, which I think is a pretty good comment for us. So where are we now? The PMI is dedicated to promoting and preserving the history of Victoria. ICTICE has become even more important as local council libraries under pressure from funding cuts and the needs to keep up with ever-shifting technology jettison a lot of their non-fiction collection. Public libraries have to have up-to-date current public collections, but that means that not everything gets kept. So we exist as a largely print library, though we do have over 6,000 electronic resources as well, in a very technology-heavy world. And stand by the principle that not all the information in the world is available on the internet. The collection is about the small scale of history. It's about tracking down those little stories, tracking down the books that might have 50 copies printed which reside in someone's garage. We have quite a few of those. One of my favourites is we have a history of pea growing in the Colac district. Like that someone wrote a book on that is just amazing. So the PMI's collection is an invaluable resource for anyone interested in Victorian and Australian history. Members include everyone from architects to archaeologists, from fiction writers to professional historians, from family historians to film and television producers and researchers, and in some ways the most important of all, people who just love reading about history. The PMI staff, volunteers and board work very hard to make sure the PMI continues to thrive. This is actually a photo of some of our staff and volunteers from a couple of weeks ago when Elena, volunteer there, decided that everyone should wear the same colour for the first Tuesday of every month. So we all got quite enthusiastic about it. So this is all of us, quite a few of us wearing red a couple of weeks ago. So we really are a community, and the fact that we started as a community and continue as a community is really very lovely. So we've got more than 40,000 items, books, periodicals, ephemera, zine, Blu-rays, CD-ROMs, electronic resources. One patron, 5 staff, 6 board members, 32 volunteers, and 872 members at the moment. So the PMI is first and foremost a community, as it has been since our inception in 1854. We've come a long way since that first meeting on the 1st of May, when we declared ourselves into existence. But in many ways, the more things change, the more things stay the same. The PMI is still a membership library, which can be joined for as little as $30 a year. This is the bit where I did spiel, so bear with me. It's well worth joining. It both have access to a fantastic collection, and I am the Collections Librarian, so I'm a bit biased, but also to support such an august institution with such a long and involved history, and to help ensure that we're still around in another 170 years. So thanks for listening, and I'm more than happy to answer questions, and of course show anyone around the library who would like a tour. Thank you. Any questions? No. All right, well thank you everyone, thank you for coming, really appreciate it.
You just need to know more like the shop.
Oh, sure. Wendy is the head of our friends. We're going to open the bookshop up downstairs, so if anyone wants to go and look at some of our second-hand books that we sell to raise money for the library, you're very welcome to. And if anyone would like a tour, we'll head out there and I can show everyone around the main part of the library as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. How are you? And it was a man from Victoria taking pictures of him. Yes.
Yeah, Ken James. Yeah.
Is this one then?
Yeah, he has, he and, Pam Baragwell, he wrote these laws because, which is the new book on the Mechanics Institute. They just thought it'd be quite a lot. Just turn it off. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, Ken's always good value.
Thanks.
Questions? We have
Yeah, maybe.
not many. We have